So I am really excited today because this is Avrum Bluming. Is it Bluming?
Perfect. Yes.
Bluming and Carol Tavris.
Correct?
Oh my
Yes.
goodness, I got them both right. Avrum Bluming, MD, and Carol Tavris, PhD. And this is the book. I mean, this is the book that changed everything and is changing everything. And I can't believe I get to talk to you guys today. Let me just read your bios so that everybody knows. I'll put my glasses on. It says Avrum Bluming, MD, is a hematologist, medical oncologist, and emeritus clinical professor of medicine at the University of Southern California. He is a former senior investigator for the National Cancer Institute and a master of the American College of Physicians, an honor bestowed on fewer than 500 of the 100,000 board-certified internists in the United States. Carol Tavris, PhD, is a social psychologist and writer. Her books include Anger, The Mismeasure of Woman, and with Elliot Aronson, Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me. I love that title. She has won numerous awards for her writing about psychological science, skepticism, and gender equity. But let's get into it immediately. What the hell happened with the WHI, the Women's Health Initiative? Why was everyone taken off of estrogen?
How could that not happen? The WHI is the most expensive study ever financed, certainly by the United States government. It cost so far over $1 billion, and it's going to cost more because the results are being reanalyzed and still being followed. Usually when a study comes out, it comes out in a medical journal article so that doctors read it and form opinions about it. Uncommonly, this article was preceded by 1 week by a press conference. That's very uncommon. And the press conference generated alarmist headlines in newspapers around the world, including the New York Times, which wrote that although this study was supposed to go on for quite a few years more, it was being stopped prematurely because they found that the drugs they were using, and there were two arms to the study. One was estrogen alone to postmenopausal women, all of whom didn't have a previous diagnosis of breast cancer, versus estrogen and progesterone to women who still had their uterus, also with no previous history of breast cancer. And they found that these studies showed that there was an increased risk of heart disease, of breast cancer, of death among women who were randomized to the hormone replacement therapy of estrogen and progesterone. And so they were stopping that arm of the study prematurely. That made headlines around the world. Within the United States, the frequency of hormone replacement therapy prescriptions fell from somewhere around 44% to less than 5%, where they are now, 21 years later.
A little social context for this, though, Av, if I may interject. What was so shocking and startling about this press conference and its alleged finding, I say alleged findings because they were not, in scientific terms, statistically significant, but all right, was that at the time that the Women's Health Initiatives landed on the land in 2002, up to that point, there was a widespread consensus among oncologists and gynecologists and other physicians about the benefits of hormone therapy for women in menopause. Bernadine Healy, the first woman head of the NIH, said, boy, you know, when I hit menopause, I'm starting hormones without a blink because it increases women's lives, it reduces the risk of heart disease, many other benefits. That was what was widely known to be true by the year 2000. Then comes this BUMO study, and no wonder people were shocked and surprised. What everything we thought was so is not, because our previous studies were inadequate in some way. That's one of the reasons it was such a whammo effect for doctors who had been going along thinking, you know what, this is really pretty much safe.
But wasn't it also the way that they read the data?
Who
Sorry,
read the data?
who read the data? What?
Wasn't it also the way that the data was read to make it seem as if estrogen were bad and cause breast cancer and heart disease?
Actually, no. If you read the data, and there are thousands of articles produced each week that many physicians are obligated to keep up with in one form or another. And the actual data of that first study, which came out on July 17th, 2002, said that no, estrogen didn't increase the risk of breast cancer. And the combination of estrogen and progesterone that they said did increase the risk of breast cancer, they said it wasn't statistically significant, but they didn't say it that way. They said it almost approached nominal statistical significance. What does that mean? Nominal statistical significance means that even though the study was not meant to check for breast cancer, its primary goal was to look for heart disease. They said, but disregarding that and disregarding the fact that the risks weren't balanced for breast cancer, if we just look at it cold, when you look at all of it, it's still not statistically significant, but it approaches nominal statistical significance. That's never stated in an article.
Right,
That's
and
like
also
horseshit.
nominal statistical. What I read in here was you can be an airline stewardess. I don't know what they call it now. What is it
Oh.
called?
Oh.
Air person.
Whatever the right word is now.
Flight
Yes.
attendant, flight
Flight
attendant,
attendant.
flight attendant.
Yeah.
You could be a flight attendant and have a greater risk of breast cancer than the statistically insignificant or nominally statistically significant measures from the WHI.
Well, Carol was really amused when we reviewed the literature looking for increased risks for breast cancer. And we made a whole list of absurd
Yeah.
statements that were published in peer-reviewed medical journals. And when you look at that, the increased risk, even if you accept that the WHI was correct, and we don't, and it isn't, but even if
We
you
don't, and
accept
it isn't.
the increased risk is an increased risk of non-fatal breast cancer of 1 per 1,000 women taking it. Now, that's what the WHI is reporting today, 21 years later, and we show that in the literature, eating 1 extra serving of French fries when you're a child per week has a greater increased risk, or eating half a grapefruit. And the reason we put those in is not because they're real, including the flight attendants. They're patently absurd, but they were published in peer-reviewed medical journals, and the increased risk is greater in that situation than it is in the WHI that generated headlines around the world.
Exactly.
So then what happens? They come out with this press conference. I remember Matt Lauer going on the Today Show saying, it's dangerous to take hormones. And then everyone in my mother's generation stopped.
Exactly. Exactly.
Correct. Doctors.
They were truly terrified because it wasn't just breast cancer. It was all the global health. Was it the global mortality index or something too? I mean,
Yes.
it was really terrifying. We're stopping the study because the risk for breast cancer is so great. We're stopping the study. That always makes people stop dead in their tracks. If it's that we found out ahead of time that there's a serious risk, we have to stop the study because we'll be killing women otherwise.
And what we now know is every single one of those claims has been walked back by the Women's Health Initiative. Remember, I said the incidence of prescriptions is still less than 5%. Every one of those claims has been walked back, with one exception, which is this increased risk of breast cancer, which is not valid, and we ought to get into that. But the increase is non-fatal breast cancer, 1 per 1,000 women taking it. But one of the statements they made in another article published the following year was that not only do hormones do all these bad things, they don't even improve the quality of life. And I have to defer to Carol talking about that.
Well, this is my rant. First of all, the average age of the women in the Women's Health Initiative was 63. They were past menopause. So now how are we going to determine whether hormones are beneficial for women who have menopausal symptoms? First of all, we eliminate the women having menopausal symptoms. And we, I mean, really the bottom line about the Women's Health Initiative, we can give you plenty of funny and tragic examples. The really horrible realization about it is what a scandalous piece of science it was and remains. Over the years, we have learned more and more about the violations of accepted scientific practice that they committed, starting with the fact that of the 40 principal investigators, only 3 wrote the report that appeared in that original JAMA article. The other 37 did not even see it until that article was on its way to the printer. Interestingly, they remained silent. They didn't issue their own press conference saying, we dispute this, which itself is an interesting point. We now know that the principal investigator, the leader of this whole project, Jacques Rousseau, had published a paper a few years earlier saying, it's time to stop the HRT bandwagon. It's time to stop it. And this cardiologist is the unbiased head of this investigation. We also know how much distortion in the way they interpreted and manipulated statistics they committed, and how they intentionally silenced dissenters in their own group. Now, these are all massive no-nos in science, and how they got away with it for so long. Well, the money, follow the money. This was huge. This was supposedly a double-blind randomized sample. That's the gold standard of medical research. And they came with such acclaim and such authority. Who wants to say this emperor is standing stark naked in the street?
Just to amplify one additional point, when we spoke about symptoms, Carol mentioned, but I want to stress that since the median age was 63, most of these women were almost 10 years post their last menstrual period.
Well past menopause, yeah, right.
Well, yeah. And what's really important is they said if we took symptomatic women into the study, they would know within a week whether they were getting a sugar pill or the hormones. And so we intentionally excluded symptomatic women from the study. And our conclusion is that the women who had no symptoms at the start of the study had no improvement in the symptoms they didn't have once they got hormones. And if you read the article carefully, and it's hard to read every article carefully, 13% of the women were symptomatic. And by the way, those 13% did have a significant improvement in symptoms. But the New York Times headline, written by Gina Colada on the New York Times, was not only do hormones cause all these bad things, they don't even do the things we thought they did.
And so what this, shows, first of all, how many people in the general population we trust our science writers to do their
jobs.
And then do their jobs, but they often don't. Statistics are complicated, and who wants to read a complicated statistical journal article to see what's really inside there? There are
but there were real world problems that came out of this. And I would even say, from a personal standpoint, I was given bad information for over 10 years because of this supposed risk of breast cancer, meaning I had heart palpitations that nobody ever thought might be related to loss of estrogen. After I had my uterus out, nobody told me to go on estrogen. In fact, they said, absolutely do not. even back when I was on the pill and this study came out, they said, oh, you should stop taking the pill. It could cause breast cancer. So many bad pieces of information filtered down from that massive study and that massive push in the media to those of us in our doctor's offices asking questions and getting truly bogus information answers.
Exactly. The doctors were scared too. I think they suddenly felt, oh my goodness, we've been promoting the wrong story and we better keep our patients. To this day,
Oh yeah.
they share this fear of breast cancer. And this is why it so impresses me. I knew Avrum's work and the way he had been investigating what was known or not known about estrogen. And he'd call me up and say, here's another myth debunking finding about estrogen. Estrogen levels soared 9 to 10%, 9 or 10 times as high during pregnancy. Why isn't pregnancy a risk factor for breast cancer? And what if you're diagnosed with breast cancer when you're pregnant? Should you have an abortion? And I've said, to my shock and shame, many women were advised to have an abortion early in pregnancy if they were diagnosed with breast cancer, because the estrogen will be feeding the breast cancer. So many.
And what we know today is even the WHI, looking at estrogen alone, which never showed an increased risk of breast cancer, they now report that reviewing their data with 19 years of follow-up, estrogen alone for women who don't have a uterus decreases the risk of breast cancer by 23%, decreases the risk of death from breast cancer by 40%, and decreases the risk of death from all causes. Wow. Women taking that alone live a median of 3.5 years more if they take estrogen compared to women who never took it.
And
so all of this,
meanwhile, somebody like me who got her uterus out and then 2 years later was diagnosed with stage 0 breast cancer was told, oh, don't go on estrogen. That could make it. I mean, I get so upset when I think about it. I get so upset. Go ahead. I'm sorry I caught you off, Carol.
No. Well, so upset. This is always the first flare of anger of every social movement, isn't it? Women are indeed are not sitting around passively saying, okay, Dr. Shmoo, thank you for this good advice. I'm going to, no, women want to know now, which is a terrific change of mood, I think, among women today, because there's enough information coming out about how wrong the Women's Health Initiative was. I mean, in a way, it's like a woman being told from her doctor, well, we have to do a radical mastectomy on you. You have, DCIS, we have to remove your whole breast, but you say, but wait, isn't lumpectomy just as effective and safer and less disfiguring? No, I've always done a radical mastectomy and that's what I'm going to do. It took a lot of protest and the evidence showing that those two interventions had the same results. It's hard to change doctors' minds.
I have to say that when I was diagnosed in 2013 with either DCIS or atypia, I had two doctors saying two different things. I didn't know where to turn. So I actually called Peggy Orenstein, who'd written about this in the New York Times Magazine. And luckily we had a mutual friend. And I said, Peggy, what do I do? And Peggy, the journalist, told me, don't you ever get a mastectomy, which is what one of the doctors who said I had DCIS was telling me to do. And thank God for Peggy. And thank God for the Whisper Network. And when are we going to get out of this Whisper Network and start having real science? I mean, this is,
yes.
Not only are we not studying women's bodies as much as we should, or have never studied women's bodies, but we are giving them patently wrong information.
This is exactly right. And by the way, since you know Peggy, I was meaning to write to Peggy. She is a big fan of Susan Love, right? She wrote the tribute to Susan Love in the New York Times. And Susan Love, bless her heart, she did plenty of good things in terms of listening to women, being sympathetic about women with breast cancer, but she was dead wrong about estrogen. She thought it poisoned women. It was a poison for women. So call up Peggy on that one, won't you? But anyway,
I don't, I
but
want
yeah.
to, I want to actually get into like some nitty gritty here because, for example, I had emailed you a bunch of things, going on with me personally, and we were talking about the fact that I had an osteoporosis diagnosis, and I can't get a doctor's appointment until March, and I was diagnosed in June. So I just went online and I started reading, well, I guess I should be on vitamin D and maybe I should be taking calcium. And you wrote back and said, maybe not calcium. Tell me what you know.
Sure.
Go out.
Vitamin D and calcium are effective in improving the strength, the brute strength of bone in exercising premenopausal women. They do nothing in helping bone in postmenopausal women who are not taking estrogen. And what we explain in the book is when we think of bone density. Bone density is actually the calcium envelope in which the spongy form of bone sits.
Mhm.
Bone isn't solid, as you know from eating chicken. It's
Right.
not, it's got a central cavity that's lined by fibers. It's those fibers inside that are made of collagen that give bone its tensile strength, which means its strength to bend and then come back to its original form without snapping.
Mhm.
Density is simply the density of the calcium envelope. If you want to improve bone density, and let me say at the beginning, don't do this, take a lot of fluoride, which is good for your teeth. But what fluoride will do is it will give you very, very dense bones so that on a bone density study, your doctor will come back and say, my God, you're the prize winner. But in fact, it makes bones more prone to fracture. The ability to stretch the bone and come back to its normal shape is really what you should be measuring in osteoporosis. And the best way to measure that is if we took the bone and put it in a vise and saw how much pressure we had to exert before we snap the bone, that would really give us a measure. But obviously, we don't do that. And so bone density is the next best thing, but it's a bad next best thing. And looking at bone density, there is a new term that came up, which is not osteoporosis, it's osteopenia, which isn't osteoporosis on bone density criteria, but it's almost there. And so there are people treating osteopenia. Osteopenia is a non-condition that is not associated with an increased risk of bone fracture.
Mhm. It's a wonderful example of, as we say in the book, brilliant marketing and vested interests. Because what happened is if you have a cutoff diagnostic for what constitutes osteoporosis, well, what happens, if you're not quite at that level, but somewhere else? Well, nobody has the same measurements in their later years that they have at 20. There's going to be changes. So you don't have the bones of a 20-year-old. Well, that's a shame, but there it is, right? But osteopenia was a completely made up term just to categorize people in the what they considered pre-osteoporosis. Oh, goody. Now we have more people we can sell our medicines to.
And we should mention that approximately as many women in the United States die each year within 1 year of an osteoporotic hip fracture as die of breast cancer.
Right.
And the single best preventive, which is now accepted pretty much across the board,
Including the Women's Health Initiative.
in preventing osteoporosis and hip fracture is estrogen, which is better than the treatments that are typically used to prevent osteoporosis. It's certainly better than calcium and vitamin D, which is still publicized on television. And yet most people don't know about that. Estrogen will reduce the risk of osteoporotic hip fracture by about 50%.
That's a lot.
That's a
Nothing
lot.
else comes close to that. And it can be continued indefinitely.
Oh, yeah, they're gonna have to pry it from my cold, dead hands.
Well,
Basically,
that's,
I wear
there
my
you go.
patch, they have to
There
pry
you
it from
go.
my cold, dead hands.
Right.
So let me ask you then a very practical question, because there are a lot of people my age-ish, younger, or older, who have been diagnosed with osteoporosis or osteopenia. And if we are on estrogen, which I've only been for a year and a half at this point, but once we start taking estrogen, what are some other things we can do for our bones to keep them strong? I understand that lifting weights is one of them. What else?
It's very easy when you have a question that is directed at your expertise, and one has to be very cautious when a question isn't directed at your expertise, not to speak with the same authority you're comfortable with.
Sure.
I like exercise. I think it's good, but I'm out of my area of comfort. Carol, you're a Pilates expert.
Do you
Over
do
to you.
Pilates, Carol?
What? Exercise is a fine thing. Walking is a fine thing. Weight-bearing exercise. These are all fine things, right? I mean, listen, I'm a woman not on estrogen.
So let me talk to you a little bit about what you found concerning heart disease and estrogen. What did you learn?
Well, this is the most important thing. Go on.
Well, several things. First, 7 times as many women die of heart disease as die of breast cancer. 7 times as many. And yet, if you ask women what frightens them most, breast cancer is way out in front of heart disease. And when I challenge women on that, what they say is, well, old women die of heart disease and young women die of breast cancer, and I'd rather die when I'm old than die when I'm young. And in fact, from age 40 on, more women die of heart disease than die of breast cancer. And the difference increases with every passing decade. So that pink ribbons and breast cancer, and I'm a medical oncologist. I take breast cancer very, very seriously, and I don't wish it on anybody. But it's been publicized as a fear factor. And it's important to walk back that fear so that you don't stop a good practice because of the fear, not because of data.
Right.
Estrogen is better than statins. And by the way, you started by saying, well, many women have been not treated appropriately because studies aren't really done on women the way they are on men. That's very true. In fact, what we've done until recently is studies are done mostly on men. And the reason they weren't done on women is women have a tendency to get pregnant. And the problem with studying a pregnant woman is you might be giving a pregnant woman, not knowing that she's pregnant, something that's harmful. So I understand that. But the results of the study are then extrapolated from men to women as if women are sort of like men and we can do that. Statins, which help prevent a primary heart attack in men at risk, don't have that benefit on women, and yet they are used widely. They can help prevent a second heart attack, but as primary prevention, they don't work. Estrogen does. It decreases the risk of serious heart disease by 50%.
This is very huge. It's very huge. And it's because, so many women now survive breast cancer. All forms of breast cancer is a 98% survival rate. And above 90% for even more serious forms of breast cancer. This is a huge change in women's fear of death from breast cancer. Yeah, it's not a welcome disease, of course, but it's treatable now in ways that decades ago it was not. But because so many women are surviving breast cancer, they have now a greater risk of heart disease and dying of heart disease. So much so that there's new specialties of
Cardio-oncology.
cardio-oncology, where we have to consider that the treatments, that if we're giving women treatments, breast cancer survivors treatments that might increase their risk of heart disease, we need to balance these out more carefully. This is a whole new area of understanding. Bernadine Healy, I mean, it was known years ago, as Bernadine Healy said, the reason that before menopause, women's rates of heart disease were so much less than men. Men were dying of heart disease at rates far greater than women. And she said, it's estrogen that's protecting women from heart disease. I'm not giving up that benefit simply because I'm entering menopause. And I think that's now what we're coming to see. The Women's Health Initiative won't have it. We are not, yes, ladies, go ahead and use estrogen for 20 minutes during menopause and then give it up as soon as you possibly can. But we're not going back to the days when we used estrogen to reduce the risk of heart disease. We don't want to suggest that at all yet.
The leading cause of death among breast cancer patients is heart disease, not breast cancer.
Wow. And I mean, I look back again, using my own experience as a guidepost here. A few years after getting a hysterectomy, I was having severe heart issues. I was put on a Holter monitor. I was having, palpitations, tachycardia. It was very, very disruptive. I would be in the middle of working and I just kind of, shudder with, I could feel what was going on in my chest. I saw a female cardiologist. Not once was I ever asked about estrogen. Not once was I ever told that estrogen could help. Worse, I was told it was because I was stressed out and that my stress was causing my heart issues. And all I could think of is, you'd be stressed out too if you had these heart issues that are not that nobody's listening to.
Yeah. Well, we start that the chapter of symptoms with Oprah Winfrey. I went to 5 doctors with heart palpitations, and I'm Oprah Winfrey, right? They better get the right diagnosis for me, but none of them linked it to her being in perimenopause.
However, in fairness, Deb, looking at your life history, stress is not an unreasonable diagnosis.
Well said.
But at the time, I was okay. I was earning a decent living. I had been under stress before then, but at the time that I was diagnosed with stress and heart palpitation, it really wasn't that. I can tell you, it was just like suddenly bubbling up, and it wasn't based on sort of a feeling of stress. It was just, I don't know.
Okay.
I war correspondent.
Oh, I was not weirdly. I mean, this was before my prefrontal cortex was formed. Between 20 and 26, I was a war photographer, never stressed once. Single motherhood, that was much more stressful to me.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, I don't know. What's the medication for that, Deb?
I don't know. So can we go over one more? I'm sorry, I'm going to take notes for a second here, but one more thing I wanted to discuss was progesterone in the pill, because that's another thing that people talk about all the time. Tell me about that chapter in the book.
Well, first, what we mentioned near the beginning is the WHI concede that estrogen alone not only doesn't increase the risk of breast cancer, it does everything good for heart disease, for breast cancer, reduces the risk of death from breast cancer. And by the way, it's also effective in helping to prevent dementia, which is an entirely different area. But if you still hold on to the WHI, they do say that the increase is due to adding progesterone to estrogen, because that's where they saw it statistically.
Mm-hmm.
I have to mention that that's wrong, and I've said that several times. We published an article last year called "'Tis But a Scratch."
It was so good.
And it was fun. I mean, the article says all of the criticisms that responsible people have leveled against the WHI haven't been countered, and I know this from personal experience, they've been ignored as if they didn't exist. And they should exist, because these are legitimate criticisms. And a criticism that's been brought up since 2004, 2 years after that first article, repeated in 2018, and we say again in 2023, is yes, there is a minimal, statistically significant, minimal, 1 per 1,000 women taking it, of non-fatal breast cancer among women who took the hormones. But wait, if you look at those data, the women who took hormones have no increased risk of breast cancer if you look at the graph. In fact, the rate of breast cancer is the same as the rate among women who took estrogen alone, and that was reported as showing a decreased risk. Well, what is going on? What is going on is the reason they found an increased risk is the placebo group in that population had a lower than expected risk. Why did they have a lower than expected risk? I'm not sure, but a significant number of those placebo-treated women were on hormones before they were randomized to receive the placebo. And if you remove those previously hormone-treated women from the placebo group, the incidence of breast cancer in the placebo group is now superimposable on the group that received hormones, showing no increased risk. And that's been pointed out since 2004. And they've been challenged on that and never responded to that.
Well, what is going on here?
And,
What is, I mean, this
wait.
guy that the lead researcher, what's his beef? I mean, let's get into psychology here. What the hell's his beef?
Well, first, he retired.
Okay.
So he no longer gives press conferences. The people who still publish are several in the Women's Health Initiative who are senior investigators, and by the way, respected people. We know their work, and we have no qualms with the quality of their work, with this very big exception. And when we wrote this "'Tis But a Scratch" article, we got a response. First time in 21 years, we
What did
got
they
a
say?
response. It said nothing.
Yeah.
Oh.
It said nothing. And that's not yet in print. That's going to come out later this month. But their letter to the editor criticizing our article is coming out. And so we responded to that. And it'll be, and you don't get a chance to rebut a response to a letter to the editor.
Right.
So maybe they'll publish somewhere else. Or maybe they'll say, mistakes were made and it was by me.
Yeah.
That would be nice.
They are. It's not just an innocent mistake. It is a it's a misinterpretation and a misrepresentation of their own data. And it's time for a mea culpa here.
I would really, really appreciate that.
As
One
the
last thing I
staff
want to
social-
discuss before we stop, which is Alzheimer's. So again, personal experience. My partner's wife has early onset Alzheimer's and has had it for the past decade. And the question we always ask, we hear that Alzheimer's begins 20 to 30 years prior to actually the onset of symptoms. There is a lot of conflicting data and analysis of that data coming out right now about Alzheimer's and estrogen. But I spoke to Dr. Lisa Mosconi up at Columbia, who is doing the study now. I'm part of her study, and she's absolutely sure that estrogen plays a role. So sure that I think she actually injected estrogen into her own brain. Let's talk about that.
What? She did?
I know Lisa Mosconi. I think she's terrific. And I never heard of that. And I'd be
She was
surprised.
planning on it. I don't know if she's done it yet, but she was definitely planning on.
There's no reason to.
She might have been
Her own brain, I can't imagine why.
She might have been saying, I'm going to drink a whole quart of it today. I mean,
okay. First, there is no prospective randomized, double-blind study of something that would prevent Alzheimer's disease.
Right.
First, because as you point out, it would have to be followed for such a long period of time, the expense would be prohibitive. More importantly, Alzheimer's disease is diagnosed based primarily on brain biopsies. And we don't do that. I mean, who wants to biopsy something so you can say, yep, that's what it is. Nope, there's nothing I can do about it. What's the point of doing a brain biopsy? And what they see on biopsy are two anatomical findings. One is called amyloid, which is a
Amyloid
protein waste product that builds up, and the other are called tau protein whorls, which are also some protein detritus that's left there. And we don't even know if that is the cause rather than the effect or result of the pathologic process going through Alzheimer's. So when you ask a neuroscientist, and Dr. Mosconi is more forceful than most neuroscientists, they won't tell you that Alzheimer's is prevented by hormones. However, the studies that are available suggest that it does help prevent Alzheimer's disease, that women who take it have a much less brain fog, whatever measurements are used, it does seem to help. Having said that, and I'm not defining what it means to help, but women know. You know, yeah, I had brain fog, I couldn't concentrate,
No.
and I started taking it and boom, I'm back. What you are pointing to is there are studies now coming largely out of Denmark, interestingly enough, that say, well, we did a review study, and the review study shows that there was a greater incidence of Alzheimer's disease among women who were taking hormones than on women who weren't. That study is absurd. It's absurd. Carol and I wrote a rebuttal to that study, which was published in the Baltimore Sun, talking about what they did. And I'd refer you to the letter rather than taking up a lot
Sure.
of time through it
Yeah.
here. But it wasn't a prospective study. It was a retrospective study. They collected several thousand women who had Alzheimer's. They looked to see among the women who had Alzheimer's whether they had an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, and this is all retrospective. And they found that there was something like a 6% greater risk of Alzheimer's among the women who took estrogen than among women who didn't. It didn't follow any of the criteria from a legitimate study. It was like a smear piece against estrogen. It almost feels like, well, if we're losing ground on the breast cancer argument, we better come back with something strong. I'm not saying that's their motivation, but I don't know of any other motivation for that sloppy a piece to be published with the ramifications that it has than egregious misinformation.
But again, I want to go a little deeper here. I want to act like a psychiatrist here. What is going on? What is this demonization of estrogen? If we could sort of look at the impetus for people to demonize something that clearly, if they look at the data, is not demonizable. I don't even know that that's a word, but you know what I mean.
It is a word now, definitely. It's a word.
Okay.
Well, so
This is a social psychology question, Carol.
I guess so. The one question we get over and over and over is what? What were they thinking? What were they doing? Why were they doing this? Why haven't they been able to change their minds? What, why? Okay. And to this, there are two answers. One is the benign, kind answer, and the other isn't. So the benign, kind. So this is the difference between Avrum and me. He is the benign, kind person, and I am not. Okay, but that's it. So the benign, kind answer is that generally in the history of scientific publications, bad news gets headlines and attention, and good news doesn't. That's just how it has always been. In psychology, you could publish any trivial difference of sex differences between women and men, the tiniest thing, why men can read roadmaps and women can't, it's trivial, it's not a fine headline. But if your study found no differences between men and women in kindness or map reading, we don't get that, we don't even get it published.
Mhm.
So that's one element, is that the news has to create news, make news, and sell news. And it's not going to do that with good news by and large, because people say, oh, well, I knew that, no big deal, right? So that's sort of one element. So perhaps the Women's Health Initiative, having spent $1 billion, felt it had to come out and hit the ground running and say something that warranted all that money, and that would get attention and money and more research and praise and applause for its tireless investigators. That's one possibility. This might, another benign notion is that these researchers, for whatever their own reasons, really thought estrogen was harmful and carcinogenic. That's the paradigm, that estrogen is a carcinogen and therefore it can't be good. You know, I mean, we know tobacco isn't good for you. What am I going to start prescribing tobacco for you? No, I'm going to do a study to show how bad tobacco is. So perhaps in the way that once you have a paradigm, you are blinded to disconfirming evidence. This is true of scientists as of everybody else. The finding shows me it's not harmful. No, the harm must be in there somewhere. I'm going to rummage around until I can show harm. Now we're moving a little away from benign to, but basically, those could have been early motives. Other motives could be, and I don't know, could be conflicts of interest with the statin industry, which at the time the study was first done, was the statins were the biggest selling drug in the world. And we know that our cardiologist wants to stop the HRT bandwagon. I'm only issuing data point 1 and data point 2. I'm not making a connection. So perhaps there was conflict of interest and vested interest in this. The fact, as we have been learning over these last 20 years, the extent to which so many of these principal investigators have really manipulated their data. I mean, right on the edge. I would never say the word fraudulent. Avrum would never allow me to use the word fraudulent. But man, there's something very strange, as the example he gave of it doesn't even help women with menopausal symptoms. Really? If you're going to argue that, there is something so unscientific, so anti-scientific about selecting out of your main data a subsample that will show what you want to show. They did this with dementia too. You know, we find that HRT increases the risk of dementia, but only by studying women who start off being cognitively impaired. We eliminate the women who aren't cognitively impaired to see how they do over time. That is just plain wrong. But you see how it takes people who are really looking so closely at what they did to show how they manipulate. You know, most readers, the public is not, are they going to care about these statistical nuances? Probably not. But the bottom line is the message that they get, which has been so devastating for women's health.
And pounded into their head over and over again by every doctor you ever visit.
Indeed.
I look at this and I think of it in the context of patriarchy and sexism as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't help but think, you know, we're old crones at this point. We're over the hill. Who cares about us? We were supposed to be dead already. We have no function anymore now that we can't have babies. I really can't help but thinking about it in those kind of more nasty terms, if you want to say, the kind that Avram won't use, but I will use. I do think that it is an issue of sexism.
It's worth.
I think it is, although keep in mind how many of the principal investigators here are women.
Oh, but they're, women are the worst tools of the patriarchy. I'm sorry.
No, you just anticipated my sentence. I just want to say this is not, patriarchy does not divide at the gender line.
No. Yeah, no. Women have traditionally been excellent tools of the patriarchy.
And in terms of changing their minds, I just have to say this about changing their minds. For physicians, for prosecutors, for anybody in any area who has spent time, money, effort, publications, their life work trying to show X, and now someone comes along and says, you know what, it's not X. What it takes for anybody, I mean, scientists are supposed to be open-minded enough to say, you know what, your data persuade me, it's time for me to change my mind. But after you've spent 20 years making the case for the harms of estrogen, what is it going to take for you to say, boy, were we wrong? That is because then you have to go back and explain why you were wrong 5 years ago and 10 years ago too. They're not after all this time and investment are they going to do that. And
We spoke briefly before about lumpectomy and mastectomy. And there were studies on lumpectomy radiotherapy comparing it to mastectomy that date back to the late 1920s. And it wasn't until maybe the 1970s when it started to be considered seriously as an alternative. And that didn't happen because doctors were challenging it, although there were some doctors who were. It's because people like Rose Kushner wrote a book and said, I had breast cancer and my doctor told me to sign an informed consent form when they did the biopsy, saying that if they found breast cancer, I'd wake up without my breast. And I said to the doctor, no, if it's breast cancer, you wake me up, let's talk about it, and then we'll take the next step. And women started saying, no, doctor, you are an advisor, and I appreciate your advice. That's why I'm here. But you are an advisor, and I have to be able to take your advice in context. And what that means is, give me your advice based on the best data you can get. And by the way, factor this into your advice, and our book wouldn't be a bad start to do that. And then let's talk about it seriously. And we think that's where it's going to change. And that's what Carol and I see happening.
How do you meet each other, by the way?
I just have one point on this, which was very important when you mentioned patriarchy and the dismissal of women and women's bodies and so forth, which is completely true. But you have to also keep in mind the strain of feminist opposition to hormones, because that has played a major role for many women in this. What are you're medicalizing a normal phase of life? You're telling me that losing estrogen is just a trivial thing and I should just use a fan for a couple of years and I'll be fine? How dare you patronize me by telling me that I have to have estrogen in order to be a healthy, sexual, thriving female? That attitude is still very prevalent.
Well, because there are also real world consequences to taking estrogen, which is, for example, I was on a drug called Divigel for a year, and then that suddenly went from, I don't know, was $50 a month to $144 a month. So you're thinking, I mean, I can understand how a woman would be like, oh, this is the pharmaceutical industry trying to get me to take something. I want to say that our estrogen should be a lot less. I know that, getting a prescription filled for a month's worth of Viagra is 76 cents. And I would like that to be the same for estrogen as well.
That's where the bias is, by the way. That is absolutely where the bias is. The cost of reproductive medications in any way for women are much greater.
And vaginal estrogen, by the time you get your patch, which I have on my back, by the time you get your vaginal estrogen, it's a pretty penny every month. I mean, thank God for Mark Cuban, who has made vaginal estrogen $20 a tube every month or it was actually $20 a tube every 3 months. But you have to figure. I actually once gave my prescription went from 0.5 to 1.0. I don't remember what a prescription changed to, but a friend of mine suddenly lost her health insurance, and I was giving her contraband estrogen, passing it off to her in the street because she needed it, and it was $144 a month. I was like, oh, here, I have a new prescription. Just crazy things. One question I have, and I've been hearing a lot of chatter from these menopause specialists, urologists, testosterone. Can you write your next book on women and testosterone?
Well, we include, I think we include testosterone in the progesterone chapter.
You swiped it away, Av.
Right. First, testosterone is marketed primarily to increase women's libido. And I don't know of any real study that did it, nor do I know of a study that could do it effectively and convincingly. Obviously, whoever you're having sex with must play an important role in that. In my 40 plus years of practice, when I gave women estrogen, libido came back. And for women who viewed it as something important, they had no additional complaints.
Right.
So testosterone is often used, well, if you can't take estrogen, take testosterone. And since it's testosterone and not estrogen, you don't have to worry about breast cancer. Well, you ought to know that a woman makes testosterone in her body, and the testosterone is converted to estrogen through an enzyme called aromatase. And aromatase treats the testosterone in a woman's body and changes it to estrogen. So it isn't clear to me why that's such a good thing, but it might also be marketing, or clearly there may be something I don't know.
I'm
It's
just
another
putting scatter on
consequence of the-
mine. Yeah.
It's another consequence of the fear of estrogen. So we can take bioidenticals, which are identical but different. We can take St. John's wort, which it's all stems to it's what we call ABE, anything but estrogen. We can't take estrogen. What can we do?
So my last question to you is, how did you guys meet and how did you write this book together? I'm very curious about just the origin of your story.
Well, first, having had some experience with Carol as you now have, clearly she doesn't come into your orbit and you just ignore the possibility of getting to know her. But that's from my side. Carol?
Well, no. I I knew about Avrum in two ways before we actually met. He had saved my sister-in-law's life as a hematologist. She'd taken a drug with a terrible, terrible side effect, an anti-stroke medication, and she was near death. This drug caused deaths in a very few people.
Aplastic anemia.
Oh,
Thank
yeah.
you. Classic anemia. Anyway, he saved her life, so I knew his name, as you might imagine. And then mutual friends, Av had set up the Los Angeles Freenet, mainly to help doctors learn how to use the internet to get information, which they were not very good at doing. So I knew about that, and he and his wonderful wife Martha were at this home of these friends. And so when I walked in and met him there, he was the man who saved my sister-in-law and the LA Freenet. So we began a conversation, which was kind of, chat. And then we over time, of course, our friendship developed, but also we realized that he was doing in medicine what I was doing in psychology, which is what in psychology we call the practitioner-scientist gap. The gap between the people who do the science and the research and the people who are practicing it as clinicians. And he was as concerned in medicine with the doctors who were following old methods and not keeping up with the research that would have caused them to change their minds. And I went, what? So we just had plenty to chat about from the get-go. And then we just became wonderful, great, close friends.
Well, this is an amazing, amazing book. If you have anything that I have not asked you that you want to say before we close this down, and then I'm going to talk to you guys for a few minutes also after we shut down the recording here. What else would you like to say that we haven't said already today?
Avrum.
Well, the reason we wrote the book is for people who have all the questions that we simply can't answer in depth in 40 minutes. That's why we wrote the book. And periodically we publish articles as well, mostly in peer-reviewed journals, but also in op-eds. And it's worth mentioning that we submitted an article to The Atlantic several years ago, thinking that that would be a wonderful vehicle to let people know what we were concerned about. And we were in a long correspondence with them, and the editor-in-chief wrote to Carol and said, we really like your article. But the problem we have is, why are you a lonely voice in the wilderness? And, there must be something wrong with you that we are missing. Well, we're not a lonely voice in the wilderness. There's a chain of people like us around the globe, but we are still a minority. They never published the article, sadly.
Well, I'll make you feel better. I am a contributing writer to The Atlantic, and one of the reasons I started this Substack and the reason I'm interviewing you and doing all of this on my own is because I kept getting articles turned down that I thought were vitally important. And in fact, the impetus for starting the Substack wasn't even The Atlantic. It was a story that I pitched to the New York Times about UTIs and estrogen and using estrogen to alleviate UTIs. And the female editor with whom I was working loved it. We passed it on to the male editors above her. And the sense I got, I didn't get exactly what exactly had happened, but the sense I got was, ew, UTIs. That's the sense I got.
So in spite of having a gender editor at the New York Times, that has not facilitated. I
I no
wrote,
longer have her, and she wrote a really mean review of my book, so I don't like her.
but this is the problem. We have been writing to the New York Times regularly with findings. I think we sent them an alert about what was coming up about the "'Tis But a Scratch" paper. Silence, silence. Why are they not reading the journals to report on this? And by the way, Deb, I mean, part of my personal delight in discovering you and your history and your writings, and you should know this, over the years, our book was not reviewed by the New York Times. It was not reviewed by major media. Peter Attia did a major deep dive podcast, and that's really what started us off. But the silence about the book 5 years ago was really deafening and surprising. Our publisher expected a real, whammo reaction. And over the years, I have written to a number of terrific investigative reporters, women and men, saying, here's the story that we can't do, which is the why question of the Women's Health Initiative. Who are these people? What was their motive? What was there a conflict of what? We could never get anyone to want to take it on. And perhaps because the major media wouldn't publish or fund such an investigation. But just saying that that's a great puzzlement to us too. So you can tell your viewers, there's
my viewers, my readers. I have about 10,000 people on this Substack right now. Most of them are women. I would say a quarter of them are men. I would say 3/4 of them are middle-aged women. So I have an audience here that is hungry for this information, and I plan to keep feeding them as much as I can, wherever I can, whenever I learn it. But I do think I want you to also feel better about the fact that this wasn't reviewed when I tell you only my last book, Lady Parts, was reviewed by the New York Times. And so cruelly at that, they called my near death from vaginal cup dehiscence gross, a quote, gross, that you're better off not having the New York Times cover it.
I will add 2 quick things. One is Albert Einstein said, my greatest talent is my persistence. And Carol and I share that with Einstein.
Good.
The second is I had a very informative interaction with Rosalind Yallow, who came to give a talk at my medical center quite a few years ago. And she started the talk by showing the 21 letters of rejection that her paper had received from a variety of medical journals, followed by the letter from the Nobel Committee telling her she was awarded the Nobel Prize for the 22nd choice that finally published her paper.
Yeah, I mean, we could go on and on about that, but I'm going to stop the recording now because this has been amazing. I don't want it to go on too long, but stay on for a second and then we will chat at the end. Hold on, let me figure out how to stop this recording. Here we go.